Mr. Speaker, and I will be sharing my time with the member from Western Arctic. Well, Mr. Speaker, I do want to begin my remarks today on Bill C-38 by saying, and it should be said, that this clearly isn't only a Budget Implementation Act. And I find it very interesting listening to the Parliamentary Secretary's comments just a few moments ago when she chided the Liberal member for the record of the Liberal government for bringing in a massive omnibus bill as well. And I remember that bill, C-43, but it is curious because I seem to remember that the Conservatives in opposition at that time certainly had lots of concerns about what was hidden in that massive bill. I think it was about 1,000 pages. And I remember the debates in this House about how they were trying to hide and rush things through. Well, here we are today in 2012 with another budget implementation bill that's anything but. It's become a massive cover for putting through major public policy issues under the guise of a budget implementation bill. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, just for the record, that's really bad public policy. It's a terrible way to make decisions. It's a direct attack on the ability of members of Parliament to examine legislation. Much of this stuff that's in this budget implementation bill should be coming to the House as standalone legislation. And when you go through the list, when you go through those 422 pages that comprise the current Budget Implementation Act, you can just see how far-ranging the decisions are, the directions are in the bill. For example, we know it's raising the age of eligibility of OAS and GAS from 65 to 67, something that the Prime Minister never campaigned on in the last election. For heaven's sake, it repeals the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act, meaning that the government is no longer required to report on its emissions under the Act. That's in a budget bill? They're putting that through in a budget bill? Is there something that they want to hide from Canadians here? I think so. As we've heard many times in the House, it guts environmental assessment regime and fish habitat protection. Again, this should be standalone legislation that on its merit the government should have the guts to bring forward and be willing to debate in this House instead of trying to sneak it through in a budget implementation bill. Just in terms of the changing environmental assessments, this is going to have a major impact on my province in British Columbia on things like the Enbridge pipeline, where there's been incredible public interest in being involved in a democratic public process to comment on the environmental impact and assessment of that project. What is the government doing? Well, they use the budget and the Budget Implementation Act to actually shut down and to gag the public and say that not only are they putting short timelines on these major assessments, but they're also going to delegate authority to other authorities, including the provinces. So they're basically narrowing the opportunities that people have to comment on these important things. And to add insult to injury, Mr. Speaker, not only does this bill gut environmental requirements, it also goes after civil society organizations by saying that the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, is going to tighten up what kind of political activities can be engaged in. So there's an attack on both sides, both from legislation, but also in terms of trying to fetter and gag the work that very important organizations do in our country to bring awareness to these major environmental projects that have a huge impact on all of us. Few other little things, little gems that are in this budget. Repeals the Fair Wages and Hours of Labour Act. Now, this is something that I'm very familiar with because as a city councillor in Vancouver over many terms, we actually used the Federal Fair Wage Act to set a sort of a benchmark for what we did municipally to pay fair wages to municipal contractors. So now all of a sudden this act is gone. It's been there for decades. I don't know how far it goes back, but it's been kind of a benchmark of what is considered to be fair wages. Now, presumably, this is now being completely eliminated because the Conservatives want to give more handouts to their corporate buddies, and they want to undercut union wage rates. I mean, this is an attack on labor, just like we've seen with Bill 377, where they're attacking labor and trying to allege that then they're not transparent organizations when we know they are. So this, again, is hidden in a Budget Implementation Act. It also amends the Employment Equity Act so that it no longer applies to federal contractors. Now, this is a major shift in public policy. I was part of the standing committee that reviewed the Employment Equity Act. It has to be reviewed every 5 years. The federal government is mandated to cover employment equity, both in terms of its own direct service, but all of the areas that it covers, like transport and airlines and banks. To amend the Employment Equity Act so it no longer applies to federal contractors, again, is just a sheer gift and bonus to their buddies, and saying, well, you know, things like employment fairness, things like fair wages, things like ensuring diversity in the workplace, they don't count anymore. You don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a major and dramatic shift in public policy. I also want to mention a few local things that are very concerning to me. Something that's just purely mean-spirited, cuts to the CAP program, which means that for low-income people who currently can gain access to the internet through something called the Community Internet Access Program, they're no longer going to have access to that. So this is, you know, this is just sort of a small thing, but it really does affect people. We live in an internet age, and there are lots of Canadians who still don't have their own computer. They don't have access to the internet, and they use the Community Access Program to actually have that opportunity and capability. Why on earth would they go after that? Why would they target people in that way? Now, Mr. Speaker, in the few minutes that I have left, I do want, as the health critic for the NDP, just speak very briefly about some of the health aspects. We've said in this House many, many times how absolutely staggering it is that there will be a $31 billion decrease in health transfers to the provinces. I mean, this is, again, a massive shift where the federal government unilaterally, the Conservatives unilaterally made a decision about health transfers in this country without any negotiation, without any debate or cooperation with the provinces and territories, something that's unheard of. So this is a pretty major assault on our healthcare system. But it goes even further than that, Mr. Speaker. One of the little sneaky things that's in the budget is amendments to the Food and Drugs Act to give the Minister of Health more power to, now supposedly on the basis of streamlining and improving the efficiency of various classifications of foods and drugs, but basically what it's doing is giving the minister more power to set up her own regulatory process and go outside the system. This is, again, something that should be coming forward in its own piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by just saying what this budget doesn't address. I live in Vancouver. In Metro Vancouver, probably the greatest issue we face is the lack of affordable housing. I've met with the Housing for the Coalition for Affordable Housing in Metro Vancouver, which, by the way, is made up of building owners, apartment owners, tenant groups, co-op housing groups. It's a real broad coalition, and they're all saying the same thing, that the federal government must be part of a solution to build affordable housing in this country. Where do we expect workers to live if they're paying 50 or 60% of their income in rent? They can no longer afford to live anywhere close to where they work. The hotel workers, the people who work in the stadiums or the waterfront or in the service industry. This is a major issue in Metro Vancouver, but also in other Canadian cities. And yet there's not a single word in the budget or the Budget Implementation Act that would make this a priority. It's just zero. It doesn't exist anymore. And so when you look at this contrast of handouts to their friends in the corporate world and ignoring the real priorities of Canadians for basic human needs like housing, like shelter, like good pensions, and as I said, even something like access to the internet, All of these things have either been ignored or they've been cut. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a terrible budget. It's a terrible act. We should be offended as parliamentarians that this budget implementation bill is so broad, that it has so much in it that we can't even begin to debate, now especially that there's a gag order on the time that we have for debate that was passed earlier today. I mean, what an affront to parliamentary democracy. So we're here to stand up and say we oppose this bill and we'll use everything we can to oppose it all the way. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, a few months ago, our Prime Minister was overseas, and he started to talk about senior pensions. And there was this huge outcry here in Canada that really swept the country from coast to coast to coast. And it was that how dare the Prime Minister look at our pension programs, something that Canadians have treasured and see was one of those fundamental social programs that is absolutely essential not only to keep and maintain, but to look in terms of ways in which we can enhance. Now, appreciate to a certain degree they might have backed off from what their original thoughts were, but still a vast majority of Canadians, we believe, and the Liberal Party believes, that we have to maintain the option for retirement at age 65 as fundamental to our pensions, Mr. Speaker. And I'm wondering if the member might want to comment on the age, raising from 65 to 67, us believing that it is wrong and it has to be maintained at 65.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the meeting that the member was referring to that the Prime Minister attended was actually a very exclusive meeting of billionaires and kind of big movers and shakers in Davos, Switzerland. And it was pretty insulting to all Canadians that the Prime Minister chose that venue to make a major decision about their intention to bring about a fundamental change in our pension system. And so I would agree with the member. I recently held a public forum in East Vancouver on pensions, and people are hopping mad, not only the seniors but also younger people, because they know the impact that this change will have. And so by raising the age, it means that people in their older years are going to be having to work longer, but it also changes the dynamic in the job market and means that there are less opportunities because more people are now forced to work longer, or else they're going to be on the provincial welfare rolls. So another example of provincial offloading.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, I stand to take advantage of this opportunity to tell Canadians that the member opposite is misleading them. The previous NDP Speaker said earlier that democracy was at risk in all of this, but she was misleading when she said that the limited time was unprecedented. Well, 7 days is actually historically the longest period of time in the last 20 years. She was upset about it being 10 years. Well, let's go 20 years. And the member opposite who just spoke is also upset about 7 days of debate. Well, over 20 years, 2 days in 92, 4 days in 92, 4 days in 94, 5 days in 95, 3 days in 96, 2 days in 97, 3 days in 98, 4 days in 99, 3 days in 2000, 3 days in 2001, 4 days in 2003, 3 days in 2004, and it goes on and on and on. In 20 years, we have never seen this length of debate ever before. 7 days is plenty of time. They need to start talking about the measures that they will support and can help Canadians do better here in this country.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, I thank the member for her comment, but I have to say that we've also never seen such a terrible bill that has so much horrible stuff in it that we won't even get to really talk about. Because the debate will happen so quickly. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I think we have to look at the context of what's taking place here. We have seen almost every single piece of legislation that's come through from this Conservative government be under a gag order of some sort of closure. What are they afraid of? Are they afraid that there's more of us that are going to speak to this? Or are they so dismissive of democratic practice that they want to shut down debate in this House. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, the member can read from whatever list she wants. The fact is the record of this government in gagging Parliament and gagging members of Parliament in debating substantial issues in this House is now something that is happening on a weekly basis. This is just the latest example of the budget implementation bill.
Resuming debate.